WMSE 91.7 FM in Milwaukee. And today I am with Paul Host, and today is July 25th. A little bit after 12:30 p.m. We are in Studio B. It's the place to be with Paul Host. How are you doing, Paul?
Well, doing good. And Dad, it's nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. This is the best radio station in Milwaukee, perhaps Wisconsin, maybe even the world, and that's why this project means a lot, I think, to our city, and hopefully WMSE future listeners can benefit from your wisdom and your experience at the station, learn a little bit more about how WMSE works, and learn a little bit about you, Paul. Let's start from the start, and because I don't even know this, so why don't you tell us where you grew up?
Okay, well, I've been in Wisconsin and basically Milwaukee all my life. Was born in Milwaukee and then lived in Wauwatosa until about 11th grade, and then lived in Menominee Falls.
Thinking about music when you were young, Paul, what was some music that first really captured your ear when you were a child? Anything you remember?
Like a lot of folks, trying to listen to transistor radios at night. I'm not even sure why I didn't listen during the day around my parents, but for some reason, it just seemed to be the way I had to do it. And brought up on local AM radio, and that taught me to like a lot of bands like The Shag and Shadows of the Night. Later on, I think that's what drew me to punk rock.
Yeah. Well, I could see that with the transistor radio at night because it's sort of your own personal experience. You know, there's no one around to say, change the station. What's this?
Yeah, I don't remember specifically having to hide the radio or anything. It was just, I just remember that, though, at night listening in bed.
Yeah. No, that's a beautiful thing. I remember listening to Bob Uecker as a kid, just keeping it on 10 o'clock at night. Just the voice, one of the voices of Milwaukee. Speaking of voices, was there anyone when you were growing up who had a profound influence on your musical taste? Anybody who introduced you maybe to some key bands or artists?
Well, to me, it would have to be when I transitioned from AM over to FM, and we had stations back then like WTOS, which I don't really remember a whole lot of. We had WNUW, which played some progressive rock, and of course the most prominent ones, I guess, were WZMF and WQFM. And there were DJs on those two stations like Downstairs Dan and Bob Reitman and Marty Racine, Mark Krieger. It was them, I guess I would have to blame for a lot of my musical choices. For example, I remember Bob Reitman playing Jonathan Richman's Roadrunner. Mm-hmm. And that was really a refreshing thing because the 70s had grown into like limousine rock. You had all these bands, merging with, classical symphonies, and it just wasn't rocking anymore. Anyway, so Jonathan Richman was like such a breath of fresh air. And then later on, maybe Reitman wasn't so much into the punkier things, but Downstairs Dan was. And he had shows on WZMF and QFM that featured new music.
Yeah.
Stuff like Devo and, the Dead Boys and so on.
Right. Yeah. Oh, Devo's wonderful. I had a great time introducing them to my kids. They're the whole package.
Okay.
For sure. Yeah. Was there a time you started to think I could be on the radio, or did you have a time when you started to have that dream that maybe that could be you someday?
It was kind of a strange transition. When I was in high school, I could not bring myself to do the public speaking we were required to do in the speech class or whatever it was. I was just completely mortified. I ended up having to give my speech to the teacher alone in the room. It was the only way I could do it. So then when I got to UW Waukesha, I thought, well, maybe I should go on the radio because nobody can see you when you're talking. And I'd learn how to speak in public. So that's kind of what started me. And of course, I mean, I liked the music, but really I just wanted to see if I could do the public speaking. And then, of course, once I got started at WUCW, which was University of Waukesha's station, which later became WYRE, then you get caught up in the excitement that you have yourself and all the other DJs with the music you get to play, all the new stuff that was coming out, and then it just kind of becomes your world in a way, is all this music and what you talk about with the other DJs, and, that's kind of your hobby or your fun, when you go out, you go see the bands and stuff. So.
Yeah. It's interesting that you would have gone from someone who didn't want to give a speech and was just feeling petrified about it to here you are, it's you and your voice, going out, to a whole city.
Well, to this day, I still prefer to be in a room where nobody else is.
Yeah.
They can happen to hear me, but I'd still rather not speak publicly.
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of cool that maybe you had a teacher who was willing to, nowadays they call it an accommodation. They'd say, well, you're not going to be able to, get in front. Why don't you just give me the speech? We know you know the material. You can still get the grade and everything. So
there's probably a lot of us that couldn't make it without accommodation from the past.
Yeah, no, damn right, for sure. Speaking of the past, you had mentioned to me when we chatted just a little bit yesterday that in the 1980s, beyond radio aspirations, you were on the road quite a bit. Can you tell us about that?
Well, in the mid 80s, I was an over the road truck driver, and I drove through like 4 provinces of Canada, went to 46 of the 48 states for during a period of about 3 years, and it was a very eye-opening time in a lot of ways. And when you're driving and you're in a semi truck, the only entertainment you have is either a CV or the AM and FM radio. And so I really made my days a lot better by listening to all the other college stations around the country. And also the Canadian public broadcast system had something called the CBC, and there was a show, I think the DJ's name was Brett Bramby, and he would play everything from like Miles Davis to Black Flag in the same show. And I used to drive a lot over through Detroit and into Canada, and it was always great to get to hear the CBC, but then on the way I could also hear like Ann Arbor college radio. There was some great, really great, multiple college stations in Cleveland, and as I drove all over, there was WEVL in Memphis, and I think it was WTUL in New Orleans. There was a station in Atlanta that really had a powerful signal, and you could even hear them in neighboring states. They also had another one, I think, called WREK. But anyway, listening to all those different DJs, and once in a while even getting a chance to shop for records in some of the towns you visited. Sometimes I'd have an opportunity to drop the trailer somewhere and then drive around in just a tractor, and then I could go to like a record store in St. Louis.
Yeah.
But one thing I'll say too is that I think WMSE would probably be in the top 5, just from my own personal thoughts, of listening to all those other stations around the country. And I've always been proud of what the job the WMSE DJs are doing.
Did you ever think to yourself, being a truck driver is going to help me be a better DJ?
I think it did at the time because it really exposed me to a lot more music, and being able to occasionally buy records in New York or Chicago or LA, those cities can support record stores being more experimental. So I think it really did help. I don't know how many times I wrote stuff down while I was driving and made it a point to find it somehow, because we didn't have the internet to just press
right.
click.
Just jotting down
Yeah.
some lyrics or the name of a song or something.
Right.
Yeah.
So that way I could look for the record somewhere, either at the station if it showed up here or at a record store or whatever. Mostly it was just really, it was kind of eye-opening, and there's something good about a job that you would get paid to see pretty much the whole country,
Yeah.
you know. And there's times when it has its scary moments, you know, going down Montego when there's a little bit of snow on the ground, or Donner Pass. You know, that's a little nerve-wracking, but made it through. Still here.
Yeah. It's an important job and a part of daily life for lots of people. That's really cool that you did that.
It was fun.
Yeah. Thinking about what kind of brought you to WMSE, do you remember any of your first moments of recognition when it came to WMSE radio being something important to you?
What drew me was an article, and I believe it was the second issue of the Express, which later turned into the Shepherd Express. There was an article about WSOE was going to increase its power to 1,000 watts. And I hadn't heard it yet, but I was already on WUCW in Waukesha, which was just a carrier current station. And that means it only is in certain buildings at the school.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved, or also went and applied at WCCX in Waukesha, which was Carroll College's station. And they were actually, you know, a 10-watt station that you could hear, like, especially in the city of Waukesha. And I did my first show there with a gentleman named Mark McCraw, who later on became the manager of the Bodines.
Huh.
So, and that all started in like 1976. And then now we're coming up on 1980, and I read this article about WMSE coming into being. And this was just super exciting to go from like a 10 watt to, oh, they're going to be 1,000 watts. So I just figured I'd come down and apply. And at that time, it was in the basement of a church. And that church, I believe, was the bookstore on the first floor. And then it was the Model Railroad Club and WSOE at the time in the basement.
What streets would that be roughly?
That would be State and Milwaukee Street on the northwest corner.
Okay.
And I was just blown away because I go there and it turns out that that's where Downstairs Dan is, Marty Racine, Mark Krieger. You know, I'm just like, wow, I can be here, you know. And there was a guy named Bob Smith. He gave me an air check, a fairly simple one. And he said, well, you're hired, you know. And but like I said, I was just ecstatic to be able to be on what was SOE at the time and then later became WMSE.
Yeah. Do you remember, did your first show have a particular name or a genre that you primarily played?
No. About the same time is when I first met Downstairs Dan. When I said my name to him, he said, oh, that's a good name for radio. You know, Paul Holt.
Yeah.
You know, the host of the show. So I just thought, okay, I'm going to stick with that. If Downstairs Dan thinks it's good, I'll just go with that.